Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Publica. In the episode of today I will talk about Jürgen Habermas, which is a philosopher, political theorist of the Frankfurt School. This kind of organization was created in the 1920s, 1930s in Germany. Some of their more known members were Theodor Adorno, Mark Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, which I have made a video about him before. And Habermas is the only one of the old representatives that's still alive and writing prolifically nowadays. One of his most famous works is The Public Sphere, and in his work he represents all his ideas regarding the deliberative democracy, which for him is fundamental in order to legitimate the lawmaking in the societies. Public sphere symbolizes this idea of a place in which the people can gather, can discuss everything that is happening in society in order to reach a common point and to progress within the system. In that sense, Habermas' main ideas are deliberative democracy, the public use of reason, all within the public sphere, which nowadays we could extrapolate to the idea of social media. I mean, there cannot be bigger public sphere than this one, but also this have some problems. The fact that there are millions of people speaking with the short length of 140 characters. Also the algorithm that makes you to follow people with your similar ideals, and this has been demonstrated tend to polarization, so it is difficult to understand. So Habermas makes a kind of genealogy of the public sphere, going back to the era of the Enlightenment, when he points how people will gather in coffee shops, talk about the politics without the interference of the states. But obviously Habermas is speaking about a tiny aspect of the population, those that were able to access to higher education and so on. So this was clearly excluding a huge amount of the population, and precisely Nancy Fraser, in her essay Rethinking the Public Sphere, she criticized Habermas for not taking into account those people who in the past were excluded. So, why does Habermas argue that deliberation is fundamental in order to legitimize lawmaking? The German philosopher has developed his philosophy according to the needs of modern times and the current Western hegemony of liberal democracies. In doing so, he understands perfectly the paradigm of globalization, multiculturalism, and inclusion of minorities within the so-called public sphere. Hence, in a highly diverse society, the idea of establishing a legislation without considering this variety of opinions would seem risky, to say the least. And yet this might have been the cause, or at least is what Tully points when he criticizes the Constitution as one of the few aspects which has not evolved across the years. Tully is referring to the Constitution of the United States, which was created in 1787, I think. Barely has been modified since then, but even nowadays, in the most recent Constitution, are hard to amend. They were created by the elites in order to precisely not make easier to modify some laws of the Constitution. And this is what happened nowadays, that we see how society has progressed in many ways, and still we are following some kind of Carta Magna that has been written decades or even centuries ago. In that sense, the Constitution does hardly include the different minorities of the people in the different areas. And precisely this is the criticism that Nancy Fraser do to the bourgeois public sphere designed by Jürgen Habermas. A framework to gather and deliberate will lose its democratic potential if there are people excluded from the debate. And even when women, black or gay people, for example, are able to participate, the condescending attitudes of the dominant groups may eject an indirect and subtle impediment for those minorities to raise their voice. It is not just people have the freedom to access to a place and provide their vote, but also it is important to change the cultural hegemony of society in order to provide real equality among different groups. In that sense, I have used the Gramscian term of hegemony, which is denounced by Fraser as an obstacle to create an inclusive public sphere. In that sense, I see note how the public sphere was a response to absolutist states by modern European constitution. It was time when state and society were set aside and people could criticize the government, as I mentioned earlier in the Habermasian and Kantian idea of the coffee houses. It never worked because, as I told earlier, there were many people excluded. And the problem is that when finally there was democracy in many of the Western countries and theoretically all the people had the right to vote, there were two aspects that for a Nancy Fraser are important and that are undermining democracy. One is the welfare state mass democracy, as she called it, this idea that because the welfare state is providing resources for the people like the public health, education, public housing, and so on, and building roads and helping to establish a more inclusive society, people do not seem so keen to criticize their own governments for that reason. I mean, you can criticize one of the part, the left wings or the right wings, but overall it is hard to imagine a society without the state for all that the state provides. And this is one of the problems that Fraser mentions when she points to the lack of freedom in the public sphere, and the other is the manufacture of public opinion. Noam Chomsky or Walter Lippmann before him had researched widely about the manufacturing consent, a term that they both use, how this idea that the media in society are basically covering the same news, saying similar things about some aspects, even the media from the right wing or the left wing, they tend to be financed by the elites or the big capitalists, and therefore it doesn't matter as much as which public are they kind of showing their content, but rather how they portray this kind of news, following a different strategy in order to create a society in which in the most important or the most significant aspect, people have similar views about different topics. This was covered by Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America in 1840, when he discovered that even though democracy supposedly was a free system in which everybody had the right to participate within the system, at the end, because everybody was reading the same newspapers, watching, not at time, but reading, engaging with the same people, it was hard to hear a kind of voice which will be considered as dissenter from the others, because it has been created a kind of hegemony about different topics in which people could find very hard to go away from that main idea. So going back to the deliberative democracy that Habermas explained in his books, he points how the language in public reason must be carried through public education. And in that sense, the role of the critical theory, it is to create a more rational society. Establish an explanatory sociological account of modern society with this kind of normative political theory. He was from the Frankfurt school. These intellectuals were working in the 1930s, 40s, and were trying to understand society. Adorno and Horkheimer published their book, I think it was 1940s, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, to understand how the modern society had modified many attitudes in the population, and how the movies of Hollywood, for example, how they speak about them, had been essential to create a new paradigm in society, and people were not free to pursue their own interests, but rather they were just following the ideological consent in the whole society. So again, the manufacturing concept mentioned by Chomsky and Lippmann. But nowadays, Habermas, a member of that school, is trying to understand what is going on in societies and to provide some solutions. In that sense, the public sphere was published 61 years ago in 1962, and it followed Kantian ideas like going out from the state of immaturity, daring to know, and so on. This was explained by Kant in his essay, which was called "What is Enlightenment?" I think it was published in 1780, if I am not wrong, and it was the German philosopher proclaimed the assertion that people need to be able to understand new things, to educate themselves, and so on. And for him, it was more a kind of aim that has to be done by each individual rather than something imposed by society. And for that reason, he used the phrase "dare to know," like be brave, courageous to go out from your state of immaturity, leave your Plato's cave, and learn about what is going on around you, which sometimes will be very difficult to understand and even painful, but it is fundamental for the personal development and in order to help society to grow. In that sense, the public sphere for Habermas is a domain of individuals coming together as private individuals, but in a public space. This distinction is important. A space of civil society in order to engage in a genuine debate about the form of state. Similar ideas of the coffee houses in Kantian writings, but again, the problem is that in Kantian times, society was formed just by a small elite, like they tend to be male, white, middle class, and if we analyze all the thinkers of the Enlightenment like Voltaire, Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, Adam Smith, Thomas Hobbes a century before them, William Blackstone, and these kind of people, all they were like intellectuals from middle class, they were white, they were males. So for that reason, in 20th century, 21st century, the idea of decolonize the curriculum in the university is fundamental also to understand how other people, other cultures saw the things that were happening in different continents in the world. So, public reason was used at the time and still must be used, according to Habermas, to engage in debates. And the idea is to expand this realm to the whole population. Published in 1962, probably Habermas did not even think that eventually there were social media like YouTube channels, Twitter, and so on, in order to engage with a huge community. I think the role of YouTube for philosophy is very important because it can reach a huge audience, and it is you have time enough to listen the arguments of the other, you can engage in comments, and people can express their ideas, establish communication with others, and you don't have a kind of limited amount of time or word space like in Twitter. In that sense, the public sphere ideally would provide a platform for all the members of society, but Habermas is very clear in this. To avoid manipulation, we need to transform the structure of the society. This is very complicated because going back to the use of mass media, the people who are richer, most of them are the owners of newspapers, and they know how powerful are the ideas to change the hegemony in society, so they are not going to let people to speak freely in the public sphere. So they are not going, obviously, to censor these people, but they have the means on their own to give more voice to their own media. So in that sense, it's not an equal battle. Let's say people who want to express his or her ideas in a platform with less resources than to a kind of well-established newspaper that has been operating for decades or a century even, and have resources behind the structure. So for Habermas, the timeline is clear. 18th century, the bourgeois gathered in the public sphere and they were against the state. It was a domain of private autonomy. 19th century, the media started to commercialize the newspapers and so on. And in 20th century, the media already understood their power, and there was this idea of the manipulation and creating consent. And the public sphere became a domain of cultural consumption. Before the First World War, the media or the historians in universities, they were proclaiming their might of their own country, whether it was France, Germany, Italy, or the UK, in order to legitimize their actions in other parts of the world. That was important for colonization, but also for taking a side during the World War I and later on. So for Habermas, he defines this kind of current of the 20th century as refeudalization of the public sphere. And after the development of the welfare state, society and state have been fused together, and the freedom of expression, assembly are threatened, as I exposed early with Fraser arguments and also Habermas. And the public sphere nowadays, it's a conflict of interest, but not an arena for public freedom, because even though the people can say whatever they want, those who have more resources will have more space in televisions, in different channels, in newspapers and so on, and there will be voices that will be silenced, again, not as with sheer violence, but just as ignoring them and so on. So, which are the possible solutions for Habermas to provide a kind of more equal public sphere, a kind of more decent voices in the newspapers, have an alternative views in the media and other ideas? For him, it is important the decommercialization of mass media. And he proposes the idea of creating independent newspapers which are able to compete with the big newspapers. I mean, in Spain, for instance, or in UK, there are a range of independent newspapers which are having a huge amount of viewers, but still they do not have the same resources of the main media. The television is more paradigmatic about this idea, how it is difficult for an independent television to raise enough funding or to be financed to stay in the public sphere. At the same time, if somebody finances a newspaper, this stops to become independent, same as with other kind of media, and henceforth the idea of Habermas is to provide funding from the public through voluntary kind of donations in order to help these media to survive. In Spain, we have many examples like La Carne Cruda, La Cafetera, and so on newspapers like El Salto, Público, and many others. In UK, you have The Canary, you have also Novara Media, others means, and there are other newspapers like the Prisma that does not have funds in the UK, and the journalists are volunteers, and many other examples over the world. But of course, for them it's hard to struggle with the biggest newspapers. In that sense, he analyzed the communication times and the evolution of society. In that sense, his idea is that to create a normative ground for his critical theory, as I mentioned earlier, the importance of the dialogue to engage in conversation with other people, and the use of philosophy of language as an argument to rethink democratic legitimacy in the public sphere. So, in that sense, for Habermas, the diversity that must be encountered in the different societies is fundamental in order to establish a more equal society. And Nancy Fraser, as I mentioned earlier in her essay, Rethinking the Public Sphere, she points how this public sphere must include those aspects considered as part of the private sphere, who morally should be charged. Gender abuse, oppression. Okay, this is very important because Habermas points how private and public was separated before, but Fraser points that some aspects that were considered of the private realm must be exposed in public, and for that reason she points it is fundamental to avoid gender violence, because she explained how in the past the women tended to be at home, they were forced to do different tasks, and the male was seen as the patriarchal of the family, and these ideas have to be exposed in the public sphere. So in that sense, this is very important to kind of change the idea of society. And just to finish with Habermas, give some kind of a sum up about what has been said. Just again, the main ideas of Habermas are the liberative democracy, the public sphere, the public use of reason, how the media and the union of the state and society have corrupted the capacity of freedom, because we have some kind of alliance with the state for everything that the state provides us, and also with the media it is difficult to escape the paradigm of ideological consent that is being created by the different newspapers. So solutions are engage with people around the world using the technology, Twitter, YouTube, and so on, and also create independent media in order to provide a more horizontal approach to the different branches of society. In that sense, the critical public opinion must be emphasized again and has to reach importance. Because for Habermas, the language is fundamental. The way that we communicate with others, the message that we try to transmit are essential to create, as he called, quote, an ideal speech situation, end quote. Pluralism is fundamental here, the impartiality and rationality, although this is more utopian than he thinks, there is no impartiality in our world, but still have at least a variety of voices to let people choose which one they prefer, but giving equality to the different views, being from the ideologies that they might. Also, a mass democracy, commercialization of the media, capitalism, consumerism, and welfare are aspects that are diminishing the public sphere according to Habermas, and henceforth to legitimate lawmaking and progress in society. Habermas mentioned how it's fundamental to engage with the different communities, to understand each other, and to create a sphere which will help us to understand the different needs of people in society. And at the end, this will, for Habermas, be the fundamental aspect to create a better society.